Hello and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism. This is a podcast exploring how we can best maintain a sense of energy, inspiration, and wakefulness while dealing with the unique stressors of this strange and potent time. My name is Brett Kane, and I'll be your host on this journey as we survey a multidisciplinary field of practices and worldviews which help us keep our butts in the saddle of our lives. Joining us on the show today is Buddhist scholar, author, and photographer Andy Karr. Having been a student of the widely revered Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Andy has gone on to teach the Buddha Dharma all across the world, serving as a senior teacher in Khenpo Solchim Gyamtso Rinpoche's Sangha, and also as a professor at the Gampo Abbey Monastery College. He's written 3 books, including his most recent, Into the Mirror, which was released in the spring of 2023 and will serve as the foundation for the themes covered in this episode. Speaking of which, this conversation is going to be an exploration of the practice of Buddhist contemplation, the mechanics of how it works with our minds, and what it does for our meditation practice. We then take that tool to investigate the various kinds of materialistic viewpoints and the ways they inhibit our ability to be at peace, which ultimately leads us to explore some antidotes from the Buddhist tradition to help free our perceptions so that we can see with fresh eyes and with more agency. As you can tell, this is a very juicy conversation. It has a lot of useful insights, and I think it'll be great for both seasoned practitioners and newcomers alike. If you enjoy what you're hearing today, head on over to andykarrauthor.com and check out some of Andy's other works. He's got some online teachings up there and some links to purchase one of his books. I really encourage Into the Mirror. I think it is really fantastic. As I say in the start of this conversation, I've gone through 2.5 times at the time of this recording, and I'm still chewing on so much that's presented. So if you want to support this show, consider heading on over to patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism and becoming a patron. It's really just a glorified tip jar at this point, but it really does help me keep the lights on. If you don't want to support financially, that's totally okay. It's crazy out there, and I understand. You can also subscribe on YouTube, like us on Facebook, or follow us on Instagram. Any and all activity helps me kind of grow this platform and make the appeal to other amazing guests such as Andy, and really just lets me know that you're out there, which really connection is one of the sweet medicines of this century of now. So thank you so much for listening. Without further ado, please sit back, drink some tea, do some stretches, and most importantly, open your heart for Andy Karr. Okay, so Andy, hello. We are now live. I usually start the show off by just saying thank you so much for giving me some of your time. I'm sure you're a fairly busy man. So how are you doing today?
I am doing really well, Brett, and delighted to be here and not too busy to do this.
Wonderful. Love it. So, just as a preface for you and my listeners, I found your work last year. I was a part of a year-long Buddhist studies course by Ethan Nichtern, and we used your book, Contemplating Reality. It's kind of a framework to explore the different schools of Buddhist thought. And one of my big takeaways outside of you've done your research was that I didn't really know what contemplation was before I started that book. I had kind of like a surface level idea. I'm like, yeah, you're thinking about stuff. But I really attribute to that book just a deepening of my understanding of how it's a practice and like a core part of the Buddhist methodology. So I can imagine some of my listeners probably have that same surface level understanding. So I wanted to start this off by just exploring what exactly is contemplation as a practice and how does it fit into this world of Buddhist thought and practice.
Well, I think you nailed one of the main reasons for writing that book. What I observed back in maybe 15, 20 years ago when I was first working on it was that I and many of my friends and colleagues had not really reflected very deeply on the view, on the meaning and the intention behind a lot of the practices we were doing. So, a lot of emphasis on meditation, a lot of emphasis on study, although less so, I would say. And the bridge between the two was missing. At the time, I was studying with a Tibetan Kempo. A Kempo's a scholar who's reached the highest level of scholarship in the tradition, named Kempo Gampo Rinpoche. And he's not only a renowned scholar, but a great yogi as well. So he brings together the meditative and the study tradition. And with us, he did a lot of contemplation. He did a lot of training in which he asked us to reflect on the teachings that we had studied and contemplate them. So, to give you a concrete sense of that, the first time I did a long retreat under his guidance, he told me to read his very short book called The Progressive Stages of Meditating on Emptiness twice a day for a week, each chapter. So I think there's 6 chapters or 7 chapters, and I had to read each one 14 times, which if you've ever tried to read something again and again and again, your eyes get numb and so on and so forth. But what really struck me through doing that is that all the different kinds of issues and questions that would come up over the course of each reading. And that started to give me a feeling for the flavor of contemplation, that it wasn't just studying and it wasn't just meditating that were important, but somehow integrating the two. So to go on to try to answer the question you raised, the process of contemplation is conceptual. It involves the intellect, and it involves both resting and inquiry. So there's some aspect of resting with whatever you're reflecting on and inquiring about how that meets with your experience.
Okay. So how does that influence our meditation? Like how have you noticed in your lifetime of practicing, you have one of these ideas that you're kind of chewing over. Do you kind of bring that into your traditional sitting practice, or does it kind of perfume your experience? Or how would you describe how that deepens our experiential understanding?
Yeah, I think it's probably more than perfuming, in the sense that a lot of the teachings on the view are challenging views that we hold, understandings that we hold about our own experience. We might believe that we experience our own brains, for example. And studying the view might challenge that. For example, you recite the Heart Sutra, and the Heart Sutra says no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. And you can recite that and then go into meditation practice and think, oh, well, all these thoughts are coming from my brain, not making the connection between the view that's being presented in the Heart Sutra and our own experience. So, having that as a basis for reflection, you might then look and see, well, do I experience a brain? What do I experience? Where do my thoughts come from? Do they arise from some organ in my body, or do they come out of a tube in my mind? How does that work? So the contemplative process leads directly into the meditation of looking at your experience, reflecting on it. So I guess another important piece of that is that generally, in the West at least, we think of meditation as calming, pacifying, subduing our thoughts. You know, we want to get rid of the stuff that's driving us crazy, and we try to do that by meditating and pacifying. The tradition presents meditation a little differently, that there's an aspect of meditation that's very important, which involves pacifying, which is just letting be, letting whatever it is that appears in your mind, whether it's troubling or pleasing, just to be there without trying to manipulate it, without trying to get rid of it. But then the next aspect that's really important is investigating what it is that's appearing. So it's not just a matter of letting the mind settle, but then looking at the mind, whether it's settled or not. And those two things are called traditionally shamatha, which is cultivating peace, and vipassana, which is cultivating insight. So the contemplation piece really links up with the cultivation of insight. You're using your inquisitiveness, or you're provoking inquisitiveness through studying the view and reflecting on it, and then trying to see how your experience either mirrors that or contradicts it or whatever.
Hmm. Yeah. So, what would you say is maybe a key difference for people who might not have had experience for this? I think the Western tradition relies heavily on philosophizing and like using concepts and like kind of grappling with them as these external things that they're figuring out. Whereas from my experience with contemplation, it's almost like a lock and key in my experience that opens up a new, like fundamental perspective shift. But how would you describe that difference between philosophizing and then the contemplation?
There can be both in this tradition. You know, if you look at the middle way or Madhyamaka way of proceeding, they use a lot of logics. In fact, they have these five great reasonings of the middle way that will drive you crazy if you really dive into them, and for good reason. The purpose of these reasonings is to show that the way we think reality is wrong. So it really challenges us, and doing these as a contemplation, doing these as reflection, and then looking at our experience with these can be very much on the quote philosophizing side.
Mm.
You know, you have to ask yourself questions like, do things arise from themselves, from something other than themselves, from both, or without causes? That's one of the most famous middle way reasonings. And when you start to look at that, it will definitely require a certain amount of philosophizing and generate a little intellectual heat and hopefully a little fire that will consume itself.
So that's kind of is that maybe one of the key things that it consumes itself?
Yeah, very much
Okay.
so. But,
Okay.
you know, that's one style of contemplation in the Buddhist tradition. There's other styles as well. You know, the Madhyamaka is not the only teaching on the view. There's other teachings that are much more yogic oriented. And those too require a certain amount of investigation and contemplation and reflection. So the Yogacara tradition, which is another one of the Mahayana traditions, emphasizes much more looking at experience rather than looking at the logic of phenomena. But there too, it can require a very healthy dose of contemplation.
Mm.
So, one of the foundational teachings in Yogacara is that what we experience is always merely cognition. It's real, it's our own experience always. And that believing that there's something external to our experience is a view that is not supported by reality. So that one's a big challenge and requires a lot of reflection to dig into, but very fruitfully. You don't have the kind of logical tools that the middle way people use, that Nagarjuna pioneered, but you have some very good contemplative investigations to do that can be quite liberating. As you say, they can be, at a certain point, the key goes in and unlocks something. But to find out exactly where that lock is and to put the key in there can require a lot of effort, a lot of uh, diligence.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm happy, and also I don't know what the word is, but the fact that you brought up the mere cognizance, that was something that I've been chewing on from your book. I've read your newest book, Into the Mirror, probably 2.5 times in the past month, and that was the
Sorry.
chapter. No, it's okay. I love it. I'm having that experience of rereading it and getting new things every time. But that chapter, that's been something I've been just gumming trying to understand. And I do want to get into that a little bit, but more broadly speaking, is it possible for people to maybe get caught in the contemplative side of things and not actually have the direct experience, but still kind of convince themselves, like, I have a deep understanding because I can articulate these logics and I can, you know, communicate these things? Like, how do we kind of not fall into that?
That's a really good point. Um, I think it's almost inescapable, inevitable that, you study this stuff a lot and you try to figure it out and you contemplate it and develop some confidence in your understanding. And you haven't quite gotten to the point of unlocking that door, but you feel like you're kind of on top of it. And, you can get stuck there. And I think we all do to some extent. But there's bound to be some pain or suffering or irritation in your life that will show you that, oh, wait a second, all that intellectual understanding isn't really helping me at the moment.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that hopefully will push you back to to take it further.
Yeah.
And hopefully also, I think one of the things we see a lot is that there's a tendency for a split between the the meditators and the scholars. And
Hmm.
in Tibet, that was a big problem eventually, that the split became very deep, that, some people would go off and do a 3-year retreat, others would spend 11 years in the Shedra, the college, the monastic college, and not, one group would meditate a little blindly because they didn't study the view, and the other group would not meditate at all because they were into the intellectual side. So I think balancing those two is essential. And my one of my main teachers was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who emphasized so forcefully the need to do both.
Yeah.
To have the sitting practice of meditation as kind of the foundation of your Buddhist experience, and enough study along with that so that you aren't becoming a quote dumb meditator, someone who was just like trying to peace out or something.
That's very much his verbiage. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was something that I was wondering because in 2024, the year we're in, it seems like it's really common for people to come to meditation through apps or maybe like a YouTube video. And some people can create really dedicated practices using these devices, but it lacks that view and the contemplative element to it. What would you say is maybe one of the biggest downfalls of that, or is there any benefit to that, or what's your opinion as someone who's spent your whole life doing this on just this new trend of kind of viewless meditation?
I don't think it's a new trend. In the 1970s, when I first got involved, we were pretty anti intellectual, most of us, that, we really didn't want to study classical texts or anything like that. We wanted to meditate and do it ourselves, whatever that meant. So I don't think that's a new thing. And I think that anything that gets people looking at their own experience is valid and important and useful. I was just at an interesting program in Mexico with about 1,000 other people that Zongzar Khyentse Rinpoche conducted. And it was a 10-day program that is what you call in Tibetan a lung, a reading transmission. And he was reading these 7 treasuries of Longchenpa, which is a collection of 7 very important works from, I think, the 14th century. And I went down there kind of cynical, thinking, oh God, sitting and listening to Tibetan for 10 days, what a waste of time. And I found, first of all, that it wasn't a waste of time at all, that it was quite lovely uh, having him there, teaching occasionally, reading, his presence, my just being able to sit there and practice. That was all really fantastic. I enjoyed it immensely. But what really impressed me about the whole event was of the 1,000 people who were there, or the 1,200, I don't know how many it was, I would guess that 90% would never have considered going to a meditation retreat.
Wow.
But that 90% spent hours each day sitting with their own experience and hearing some teachings. There were a lot of young people there, people who might have learned about meditation from apps. And I was very impressed that, just creating a situation like that where people could connect with their own experience and with the teachings a bit could be so potent. So
Yeah.
I'm not, I've have been very hard-assed at times in my life and thought, if you don't meditate for 10 hours a day, it's bullshit
Yeah.
or whatever. But I'm I'm getting old. And I'm starting to see that there are a lot of different ways that people can engage with Buddhism and with their own experience that are really valid and helpful to them
Yeah.
and might lead them deeper and deeper. You know, at a certain point, it's going to be up to each person's individual karmic connection, whether, they have the passion to want to go deep or to keep it at a certain level or just to touch in with it at this point. And I think I have to respect all of those.
Yeah. Yeah, I think any increased quality of wakefulness in today's day and age is needed
Yeah,
on pretty much every level of society.
yeah,
I've felt very fortunate to be able to plug in. David Nichtern is my primary teacher, him and Larry. And it's just been so cool to be able to plug into such a rich lineage, and I feel connected to Chogyam Trungpa also because we're usually going through his works. And it just the honor and the responsibility of being able to plug in and seeing all the work that was laid out by your generation, and just like how it's changed as it's been the torch has kind of been handed down, and how my contemporaries are running with it as well, and the different nuances they're exploring, and the new things, the fresh kind of presentations that bring in like social justice and environmentalism, and the way that the Dharma has changed for the container of our society is just really humbling, and just been amazing to be able to be a part of.
Well, I'm personally really delighted to hear that anyone wants to pick up the torch and run with it, and really want to encourage anyone to do that in the way that they see is is real and helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in terms of picking up the torch, I feel like a lot of this conversation we really carved out kind of a methodology for how to practice in terms of how to relate to the view, how to bring it into meditation. And I wanted to shift into like the what of the practice, like
Sure.
what it is that we're contemplating. But before that, I did want to carve out a time for this conversation to kind of talk about, maybe in my eyes, is one of the biggest like caution indicators. And it was maybe the most important teaching that I got from plugging into David and Chogyam Trungpa. And this is an idea that he came up with called spiritual materialism. This to me has been one of the most game changing and immediately recognizable energies of my spiritual life of over 10 years. And it's one of those things that as soon as I learned it, I'm like, oh, I've just been going like that was my whole life.
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
so I would love to just explore what that concept is, and maybe even a broader, just materialism in general, and how this can inhibit our development spiritually.
Oh yeah.
That's a big one, I know.
It's a big
Sorry to
one,
do that.
and I think, in the very early days with Trungpa Rinpoche, probably the two things, well, maybe three things that he really emphasized a lot were the sitting practice of meditation, um, spiritual materialism, and all of the three lords of materialism, and giving up hope.
Yeah.
Giving up hope that, we're going to become somebody fantastic. And so, those were themes that he kept at year after year and really worked away at. So, yeah, I started out wanting to become a Zen master. I didn't want to become a Zen student, or I thought, oh, I'm going to become enlightened and be a Zen master like the people in the koans, or like Toshiro Mifune in the Seven Samurai. That was my ambition. So it took a little surgery to cut out a lot of that stuff. But I think, the simple explanation is that we're always trying to possess things that will augment the ego,
Mm.
whether it's physical stuff that, we want to acquire, that will make us feel like we've got the coolest or the best or the most whatever, whether it's knowledge that, intellectual knowledge, that will make us feel superior to others and so on, or spiritual experience and spiritual trappings that will make people think that we're really hot shit. Yeah, there's always that sense of hunger, of neediness, the lack of just plain satisfaction with who and what we are, which is ego's MO. It's the way that this illusory self perpetuates itself. You know, I need the next thing. And it could be spiritual or psychological or material, but there's always that hunger and unfulfilledness. And the way that works is that something appears in our mind as a desirable object, and we don't recognize what has happened. We don't realize that what has happened is mind has just appeared in a certain way. It's appeared as a new phone. And we have this idea that, oh, yeah, that would be good. And then it picks up steam, and we get more and more involved in thinking about, desiring, amping up our interest in whatever we think will make us happier, better, stronger, more respected, whatever it is. And then we act on it. We go out and buy the phone, or we start reading reviews and whatever it is, and we plant further seeds of wantingness. Uh, and, and that's called the karmic chain reaction. Something appears in your mind, you don't recognize that it's just dream stuff. You start pursuing it. You take a positive attitude toward it, you start pursuing it. You start actually doing something about that with that intention. That's planting further seeds. And then those seeds ripen as more things that appear in your mind, and so on. So those karmic reactions, at the core, the issue is you didn't see what was happening in your mind. That's where it all starts, always. But then it becomes this chain reaction that produces further things that you don't recognize.
Hmm. Well, what's wrong with that? I feel like a lot of people would be like, that's just life, right? You have a vision and then you go do it and then you move on to the next. I guess is there a negative connotation to that or
Well, there's two negative problems there. One is that that sense of being driven, compelled from one moment to the next, which never lets up, that is the fundamental dissatisfaction.
Mm,
Like, we never rest. We never just go, something is always driving us forward. And the other is the sense of being imprisoned.
mm,
We're bound. We have this sense of like no freedom of choice. When that first thing appears in your mind, you don't have the freedom to say, no, yes, whatever. You get launched in this chain reaction. So that's like ultimate imprisonment, that you're always a prisoner of the next thing that appears. And the whole point of the Buddhist practice, study, whatever, altogether is the freedom to not be driven by these compulsions, these chain reactions. And that freedom comes from just recognizing that what appears in our minds is just our mind. It's just mind stuff. And it's not the world appearing validly to us, informing us that if we do this, good stuff will happen or
mhm,
bad stuff. I mean, that goes both ways. Some things attract us and some repel us. Some create hope, some create fear. But the meaning of the word samsara is this bondage, this being driven in circles. It's literally this sense of being turned around and around, driven round and round, and never being free. So you can have a thought of a new iPhone or whatever, and go out and buy it, and no problem. If you recognize this process and you're not driven by it. But our the reason we need Buddhism is that we don't recognize it. We don't recognize that we are prisoners of our own projections.
Mm, wow, that's powerful.
I mean, that's to me is what this whole thing's about.
Yeah.
And there's
So,
lots of methods and practices and studies and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, what's really going to matter is just if you can recognize what's appearing to you and not be blinded by it and driven by it and compelled by it, then you have freedom. You can go ahead and do the yes or no, but in a way that is insightful rather than blind.
mm, yeah, that's been something that I've kind of gotten tripped up in with even pursuing something like Buddhism, because even what you just described, I feel like you could turn that into another projection. Like, all right, well, I'm
Sure.
going to get past the being driven by my projections and I'm just going to practice. And then it just like reinstates itself. And then you're back at square one. How do you determine or like suss out whether or not you're being motivated by that or if you're genuinely practicing from a place of insight? Is there any like tells that people can plug into?
Well, I think the biggest tell is that sense of compulsion,
Mm,
that you feel like you can't rest.
okay.
When you can actually let go of things and uh, be with your experience in a very relaxed way, then you're doing pretty well on the path. And as long as there's a lot of struggle involved to achieve or to get rid of or whatever it is, um, you haven't quite got the point yet.
Yeah. Okay.
And, that comes back to the spiritual materialism because that is what's driving the meditation efforts. That our meditation tends to be very effortful because we're still bound by these visions of achieving something,
Mm,
getting somewhere, instead of just being with whatever is appearing.
yeah. Makes me think of Ram Dass had this idea he talked about with like you start off with like a ball and chain, and then when you pick up a spiritual practice, you've traded that ball and chain for like a golden one. And it's like, but you're still chained.
Yeah.
You've just kind of got a fluffier, more idealistic one.
Yeah. Well, and his first book was Be Here Now.
Yeah. Yep.
Just be here now. Okay, you
Yeah.
can't be more basic than that.
Yeah. Yep. So we've talked about a methodology at this point. We've talked about how we kind of practice a path like this. We've talked about maybe some of like the warning signs. It's just the flashing red lights. Like, hey, just be mindful of that. But I do want to shift into that like what it is that we're looking at, and this is a big part of, in my opinion, what your work has done is really outlined these different kind of like stages of development and thought. So I think like one of the best ways from my perspective to kind of lay that out is by looking at the yanas, of which the Mahayana was the focus of your newest book, Into the Mirror. So for the people who've never heard of these, could you just run us through what exactly those are and why you feel the Mahayana, I mean, was such an important element that you dedicated a whole book to it?
Sure. Yana is a term that means vehicle. And in the Tibetan tradition, there's different versions of this, anywhere from 3 to 9 vehicles, which I think the notion is that as we progress along the path in our own personal journey, we need more and more subtle insights because the obstacles are becoming more subtle. At first, our obstacles are very coarse and vivid and obvious. And so the tools we need to deal with that can be fairly crude. As we go along, we become both more advanced and more subtly self-deceived. And we need more subtle methods of taking that apart, of overcoming delusion. And so the various yanas or vehicles are different ways of approaching this confusion. So the I guess the main way this is presented is in terms of three yanas, three vehicles. Excuse me. There's the foundational vehicle, which has been referred to a lot in the Tibetan tradition as the Hinayana, or the narrow vehicle. And that's a problematic term. It's problematic because it comes out of this Mahayana chauvinism, looking down on the fundamental vehicle. And so I have, and a lot of people have abandoned using Hinayana as a term. We talk about the foundational vehicle or the Shravakayana, the vehicle of the hearers. There are other terms that are used, but the notion is this is for people like us. This is people who take things to be real and solid and are basically looking after our own liberation, individual self-liberation. And so the basic teachings of Buddhism are presented from the perspective of there is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, which is desire and grasping. There is the possibility of freedom from suffering, and then there is the path that leads to that freedom. That is the fundamental teaching of the Buddha that actually, in more and more refined ways, is presented in each of the three yanas, each of the three vehicles. But in the Hinayana, it's the core teaching, the most important one. So as we make this journey and we start to tame our minds and start to recognize a bit how they work, we start to see that it's not so much the desire for things that is driving the show as our ignorance of the nature of that desire. And that is, I think, the entryway to the Mahayana, where you start to see it's an inner journey more than an outer journey. The foundational vehicle is much more connected with the outer journey of doing virtue, avoiding non-virtue, and taming your mind. There's a shift in the Mahayana where you're still doing those, but you're adding much more emphasis to the inner experience of what is happening when this delusion arises. What is happening when craving arises? What is it, craving for something, or is it craving for my version of that thing, some inner experience of it? And so the Mahayana becomes much more an inner journey and much less focused on our own progress, our own liberation, and more on trying to help others, trying to share this journey with others. So you have the two main emphases in the Mahayana on wisdom and compassion. Wisdom being developing the insight into our own delusion. And compassion being both a way of decentering, focusing on our own neediness, and looking at others and seeing how their experience is and trying to help them.
Yeah.
And then the Vajrayana, which is the third vehicle, the indestructible or adamantine vehicle, as it's called, is the path of method, where they're not changing the kind of view that is developed in the Mahayana, but they have developed further methods, powerful methods of transforming confusion into wisdom, right on the spot.
Yeah.
So those are the three yanas or three vehicles. My interest in the Mahayana in particular comes from my own experience of finding how valuable that training was to me personally, that the insights of the Mahayana are really profound and central and difficult, and require some unpacking. And I've had the sense that often they're not presented very accessibly.
Yeah.
So that's why I've focused on it.
Yeah. We've talked a few times throughout this conversation about this notion of like there being an illusory self and kind of materialism as being kind of a gate. What about the Mahayana teachings do you feel like helps us kind of pierce through that and kind of see like what is the on the other side of materialism?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two main Mahayana traditions, and there's the middle way tradition, which emphasizes the lack of nature in things. That's that all the stuff that seems to be so real and solid and independently existing doesn't really have that nature. That's something we project onto our experience, not something that is at the heart of what we see. So that really cuts through a lot of our confusion. I'll give you an example that I like a lot that came from my teacher. Often the Madhyamaka or middle way tradition talks about pillars and tables and pots being empty, being emptiness. And Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamso Rinpoche, who taught a lot of the middle way to us, said, that's great, but really what's important is recognizing that our enemies are free from having the nature of being enemies, that our friends are free from having the nature of being friends, that their nature is emptiness, and yet they appear very vividly. And once you can cut through that kind of clinging to your identifying them in a certain way, you free yourself up, and then you also free up the relationship because you're not reacting to them in some habitual way, but you can open up to however they present themselves at that moment. So, that's the emptiness that's presented by the middle way tradition. And as I think I mentioned earlier about the various reasonings that they use to help puncture our fixation on solidity. And then the other main Mahayana tradition is the Yogacara or yogic conduct tradition, yogic practice tradition, who emphasize meditation much more than reasonings or intellect, logic. And the way they approach this is not so much looking at the things we experience and showing their emptiness, but looking at the experiencer and showing that the experiencer has no nature. That whenever we have a sense of an object, there's also a sense of a subject experiencing that object that arises, but neither of them is substantial. So they provide a lot of teachings and views to help looking at that basic duality of subject and object, and to recognize that the whole thing is the play of the mind. It's not something that is a given in nature.
Yeah. it it's interesting as a Western thinker, and it's funny because I'm thinking about my dad right now. Like if I tried to explain this to him, or somebody who has no interest in Buddhism, even maybe like a psychologist who's really fixed in their view of what the mind is and what a person is, and individuality and the importance of individuation. I feel like some people might see this as like what you're describing is a form of insanity in terms of just like, is it dangerous? Like what is it to stabilize this view and to operate from a place of emptiness? Like how it seems like the forms that we construct are very helpful for orienting in the world and not just completely losing your mind.
Yeah, well, I think the danger comes when you fixate on some of these as ideas. When you think, oh, yeah, everything's empty, and you hold on to that as an idea and you use it as kind of a band aid for reality rather than that you're actually penetrating it experientially. And that's where contemplation comes in, that's where meditation comes in. That, as long as it remains in the realm of ideas, of concepts, then it's, yeah, you can make yourself pretty crazy by clinging to these concepts and thinking, oh, yeah, I'm much smarter than everyone else because now I know that things are empty.
Yeah.
Well, good for you. Tell me about it when you lose your job.
Yeah, the emptiness of unemployment.
Right. So now I've lost that train of
Yeah,
thought.
sorry. Yeah, it just seems almost unnatural. Is there
Oh, it's very unnatural. It's,
yeah.
the the Buddhist teachings, once you get off the basic foundational vehicle ways of approaching things, they are not how we normally think about reality. They are challenging our views of reality. And they do that not to be more sophisticated or clever, but because our views of reality are kind of fakakta, to use the Yiddish term. They're kind of screwed up. We cling to things in ways that the things aren't clingable to.
Yeah.
We're constantly grasping for things that will not fulfill our expectations of them. We're constantly running from things that have no power to harm us.
Mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, it might seem crazy, but only because we're very attached to a reality that's not very accurate.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting as I've done my studies into this, and this idea, even just as an idea of kind of loosening the fixity of our attachments to things being a certain way. It seems like it creates a lot of space. Like this is something that I think we don't really have a lot of room for in our society, in the Western mind, this idea of allowing things to be spacious. And I think a lot
Mm.
of people, again, I'm thinking of my dad, if I try to describe meditation as having that quality, he'd be like, oh, so you're just spacing out, but from my experience, there's an intelligence and like a clarity. Could you maybe speak to, yeah, what is that kind of fundamental knowing? I guess they call it prajna. I don't know if I'm conflating two different things, but where does that fit into this?
I think you just explained it beautifully.
Oh, okay.
I don't think I have anything to add to that, Brett. That
Yeah,
was really well said. The spaciousness that we don't normally experience. That's
yeah,
very much the the what comes from letting go of all the fixation.
yeah. It's just interesting. I mean, again, from my experience, just that sense of knowingness. There's like a pre-verbal knowing quality that is like beyond concept, and I've only really had glimpses of it. But there's just like a sense of, I mean, it's like contented. There's just this like reflective kind of thing that you can't really fabricate, you can't really grab, and you can't like. I'm even struggling. Like, I want to be able to paint a picture of it, the textures and qualities, but um, yeah, what is it?
It's not a thing.
There,
It is the fundamental nature of reality.
hmm, yeah.
Yeah, you talking about it beautifully.
Okay, well, I guess the question just extinguished itself.
No, I'm serious. I felt like you really nailed it. That is the experience of letting go of fixation, of not being deceived by your own um, projections, and opening up, relaxing.
Yeah,
That's very much the core of what this is about.
yeah,
That's the fruition.
yeah. So, you mentioned when we started the talk on the Mahayana, and I've heard it called like the two wings of a bird, of the insight and compassion. If that represents, I'm going to guess, the insight, how does compassion arise from that? Why is that so emphasized?
Well, it's emphasized because we're so fixated on ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's just self destructive. And where it comes from is as you start to cut through your own fixation, your own delusion, and realize a little bit of relief, you start to see much more how other people are suffering from their fixation and their attachment. And that is like naturally produces the desire to help them.
Hmm.
So the compassion is a bit of a tricky subject because I think we in the West, or in the modern world more accurately, not just the West, but in the modern world, confuse it for empathy. That, I feel your pain is compassion. That's not really what we mean by compassion. Compassion in the Mahayana is the desire to help other beings who are suffering from delusion. It's and that's kind of the base level of compassion. But then compassion, as you progress along the path, also becomes more subtle and more profound. So initially, it's the desire to benefit, to help, to remove the suffering of beings that really seem to exist. But as you start to recognize the emptiness of phenomena, the emptiness of all these projections, the freedom from these projections, then you're no longer carrying around this strong sense that there are other people that you have to free.
Hmm.
But you still have the mere appearance of those suffering people. And so the second level of compassion is the desire to help the mere appearance of suffering beings.
Mm.
The third level, which is the most profound and subtle level, is non-referential compassion, what Trungpa Rinpoche called radiation without a radiator. And that's the natural warmth that is beneath all the confusion that we normally experience. It's not, people hear the word emptiness and they think cold, they think vacuum, they think outer space. Emptiness means also warmth.
Mm.
There's a natural warmth that appears as we become free from our delusion.
Yeah.
And that's the ultimate form of compassion.
Mm. So I'm just going to guess that it's probably not advisable to fabricate or to try and like appropriate your idea of what this is. So for people who are on the path, who are starting to open up to these teachings of compassion and non-duality, how do they best start cultivating that compassionate attitude if it's not there organically? Should they wait and
Well,
just like work on themselves some more until they get like an intuitive sense, or is it kind of something you have to just throw yourself at and hope for the best?
I think, the number one instruction is don't focus on yourself so much. Look at
Mm-hmm.
others. Because the reason I think we're not compassionate, that we tend to not regard other people, is because we're so obsessed with our own stuff, our own desires and our own fears. And as Shantideva said, all suffering comes from focusing on our own desires, and all happiness comes from thinking of the welfare of others. So that's like just a decision. That's not even some great realization. That's like, I'm going to try to pay more attention to others' needs than just my own.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where you start.
Yeah. Is that kind of where like something like the paramitas would come in as kind of just a way to kind of look outward? Or like how does that fit into, I guess, the cultivation, or is it more of an expression? Or um, I know they're considered practices. So I guess I'm just asking about the paramitas, if that's not too big of a thing to
Well, yeah,
dive
the
into.
paramita means transcendent action. Literally, it means the other shore, going to the other shore, and the other shore is like not this, that. So it's action that isn't based on ego, on self-centeredness, and there are different schemes of paramitas, but the most common one is the six paramitas, which are generosity, ethical conduct, discipline, um, effort, meditation, and prajna, or wisdom. And each one of these is a practice, but they're more emphases in how you conduct your life.
Mm,
You might particularly focus on generosity. That's an important one, and it's also the kind of foundational paramita.
mm,
And then you might focus later on ethics, or um, patience, or not being lazy. And each of these is one of the main post meditation disciplines of someone on the Mahayana path.
mm. Yeah, in relation to it being post meditation, to me it seems like it just to engage with these kinds of things. invokes a sense of wakefulness, and you have to be mindful to remember generosity or exertion. Is that kind of the main thing? Is it really kind of brings that quality of attentiveness to just your day to day kind of unfolding?
Yeah, I hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I think it goes both ways that the prajna paramita, the paramita of wisdom or knowledge, powers the other ones.
Mm. So
So
it's kind of like,
the more your generosity is informed by intelligence or prajna, the more transcendent it is, the
yeah,
less self-focused it is.
that makes sense. Okay. Well, that's a topic I think we could probably go in for more than 1 hour. So
I think so.
I'll spare you that discussion right now. We are kind of up near that time, so I wanted to give you a moment to just kind of share how people can stay plugged in with you, how they can continue maybe learning from you. I don't know if you offer classes. You obviously have some books, but yeah, how can people find you?
Well, I do have a website, and occasionally I put courses that are going to be offered on the website. I think I will be teaching a hybrid course probably in February, in early March or something. But I haven't tied that down yet. And then I'm going to be in Europe in late March, April, probably in Berlin and London. And the big thing that I've been working on for a while now is a retreat in this coming summer, a month-long retreat of deep, intensive practice and study. And that's going to be in Colorado at Drala Mountain Center. And it's called the Entering Entering the Vajra World, I think. A 3 on a retreat. Sorry, I keep getting these notifications, and I thought I had it silenced. Are you
That's
hearing
okay.
these bings? Okay.
Yeah, but it's the modern age. It happens.
Okay. Yeah, so there'll be a month-long retreat for people who have been practicing for a fairly good while already. People who've been doing meditation and some study for a few years who might find that interesting. And some of my colleagues and I are offering that. And that's the big thing we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have all the links for that too. I'm familiar with the retreat, so that'll all be available in whatever description people are watching this from.
Yeah, but
So,
andykarrauthor.com is my website. There's no programs currently up there because I haven't gotten anything scheduled yet, but there will be some things.
cool. And also your book. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but Into the Mirror is pretty phenomenal. I mean, like I said, literally 2.5 read throughs in a month. So, yeah, I just want to plug that for people as well. Um, yeah,
Good. Well,
great book.
I feel quite good about that book. I think I managed to present a few ideas that are helpful and some practices that are helpful in there, and I
Yeah.
feel quite good about it.
Yeah, it's also pretty accessible. I mean, some of the stuff is really dense, but the way you've broken it down in there, I thought was really expertly done.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah, that's going to be it. I just want to say thank you so much, Andy, for joining me on the show. It's an honor to have you on and to be able to just pick your brain on all these subjects.
Well, it's really been nice to talk with you, and I love what you said about the basic nature of the mind. I thought that was really beautiful. And so, if people get anything out of this podcast, please pay attention to that part. That
Yeah.
was really good.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah, yeah, working with Larry, that helps.
Yeah, well, he's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Andy. We will catch you next time.
Thanks so much.
All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through until the end. I truly do make this show for you. That was the one and only Andy Karr. If you want to stay in touch with him, it's andykarrauthor.com. That link will be down in the description, so check it out. Again, I really recommend Contemplating Reality. It's a great book. Also, Into the Mirror, very good. He's also got these online teachings. You know, you're in the digital age, so you can find him if you are resonating with that. If you want to support this show, head on over to patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism. Consider just leaving a one-time tip. That helps me tremendously. It lets me know that you're out there and that you're vibing with what I have going on. Beyond that, you can subscribe on YouTube, like us on Facebook, or follow us on Instagram. It's the digital age. We all know what to do. Thank you so much for listening. We will catch you next time.